Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session, 4 Ways of Using Sources as part of our Spring Academic Integrity Week. My name is Jacques Zalm. I serve as the Director for the Office of Academic Integrity. I'd like to mention that this session is being recorded and uploaded to our website and will be posted at a later date. I'd also like to thank our presenter, Dr. Mandy Hobmeyer from the writing program, for taking the time out of their day to share their knowledge with us today. As the session title infers, this session is going to provide insight into how to effectively and ethically include sources into your written materials. This is a session I'm very excited for, so without further ado, let me pass the mic over to Dr. Hobmeyer. Thank you.
Thank you. So nice to be here, and thanks for having me. Please feel free to use the chat for questions. There's going to be lots of opportunities for us to converse throughout the presentation, but I'll just check in on those as we go along. I'm going to be projecting my screen in just a moment, so we'll go ahead and get going. Are you able to see my screen? Yes?
No, we're not.
Oh, okay. Let me try this again. How about now? Okay, cool. All right. So I'm Dr. Mandy Hobmeyer, and I'm an associate professor in the writing program as well as a faculty consultant in the Writing Center. So as you can see today, I'm going to be talking about how to use sources, both from the perspective of supporting mindfulness and academic integrity, but also thinking about how you can contribute your voice originally and meaningfully to academic conversations. So I just want to start first by pooling some of our collective wisdom. Oh, no, I do not want you to see my notes.
I was going to say, I think we're seeing your notes, so yeah.
Okay, hang on just a moment. Sorry about that. We're having all the difficulties today. Hold on just a moment. Are we good now?
That looks good.
Okay, sorry about that. Sheesh. Okay, so we're going to be talking about ways to use sources, both thinking about the perspective of academic integrity, but also thinking about how we can contribute our original ideas and voices to using sources as well. So I wanted to just first ask the group out there, when you have had instruction about sources and source use, what stands out in your mind as either the type of instruction you received, or also what are some rules or tips that have kind of stuck in your mind? Anyone think of anything?
Yeah, I think and the first rule that comes out is that if it's not your own work, it's not your own words, that it needs a citation. And then that also morphs into ideas as well.
Mm-hmm. So citation often goes hand in hand with source use. Anything else?
Could you re-ask your question?
Oh, just what are some of the tips and rules that have stuck out to you when you've received instruction about using sources in the past?
That even when like paraphrasing, you should still have some type of in-text citations.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that we overlook sometimes, like, oh, I paraphrase this, or I put this in my own words, but the original idea is still in your, in the sentence or paragraph that you paraphrase. So not forgetting the in-text citations.
Sure. Anything else?
I think
Types of
for
sources.
me,
Oh, sorry.
oh, I just remember always like the emphasis was that other author's voice shouldn't like replace your voice or your words, but it's sources are supposed to like amplify your writing or help you um, either support or fill in the gaps, but not so much take over your thoughts, your authorship.
Wonderful. Well, that's an excellent segue into how I'm actually going to be talking about using sources today. And I think, while of course citation is an incredibly important part of using sources, sometimes that really reduces thinking about how we're actually engaging with the ideas of others in a meaningful way. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. How do we elevate using sources into more meaningful engagement with their own ideas without having them, as Nancy suggested, overtake? So we're often encouraged to use direct quotations, and we're often also encouraged to use summarizing. And while these are wonderful, also embracing things like paraphrasing and really engaging critically and analytically with sources are the potential that source work has. Far too often, we focus on finding what we would think of as the right sources for our paper. If we just find the right sources, that'll make the best paper, right? And that leaves us with little time or energy to consider what we should actually do with those sources once we've vetted them. Of course, vetting sources is a very important part of the process. But today, I really want to spend time talking about how we use those sources effectively, mindfully, and analytically as we start integrating them into our own work. So that's the main problem that today's workshop is going to address. So I want to use the analogy of cooking to get us to think about how to work with sources in our paper. So I want you to start thinking about sources like ingredients, right? When we think about ingredients, there's ingredients that are all over the world of all different types. For example, garlic is delicious. So is chocolate. So is guava. But if you put together a dish with garlic, chocolate, and guava, we'd be probably muddled, or maybe even a little bit disgusting, right? So just because singular ingredients are really good, it doesn't necessarily mean that they go well together. So when you add a source to your paper, I really want to encourage you to think of yourself as adding an ingredient to a soup, right? And you don't just add things because they're, quote, good, but you add things with an understanding that they are good in a particular context, or they are good because of the way that you're using them in that specific context. In other words, we're really thinking about source work in terms of the effect that it will have. Again, in the cooking analogy, thinking about adding an ingredient to bring something more dimensional to the dish, right? Meatiness or saltiness or tanginess. So really bringing a lot of critical engagement and purpose when it comes to using sources in our work. So this is going to kind of present the overview of where we're going to be heading in the presentation today. And we've largely covered the first stop there. So really thinking about having that moment when we aren't considering sources as just inherently good or bad. Especially when we get our assignment prompts from instructors, often are just trying to meet the checklist of what we're being asked to do, right? Knowing, okay, I need to find 2 peer-reviewed sources, or I need to use 3 primary sources. And focusing on them in this way, as I mentioned, kind of reduces the potential that they have to be a really robust and meaningful ingredient in our soup. So take that moment to have a stop. We've already kind of established that as our ground point. The majority of the presentation today is really going to focus on these other elements, particularly these 2 in the middle here. So instead of focusing on the quality of the source on just a surface level, I want you to really think about focusing on the rhetorical function of your sources, meaning that the different things that your sources can actually do for your ideas, for your argument, for what you're trying to accomplish with your piece. From there, you're going to be refining how you determine a source's quality. So there is definitely a changing scale of how we're even defining good or bad in certain contexts, which is so important, especially in the digital age where we have so much information at our disposal, and it's becoming more and more important to bring critical thinking to how we consume the information around us. Getting to understand what's appropriate for academic contexts and not, as I would argue that those boundaries are really shifting all the time in our current informational climate. And then finally, we're really going to be thinking about how we're going to make these connections. How do we connect the processes of our research with our actual writing that we're producing? Your argument should inform with sources that you use, meaning the sources are there to bolster the work that you're doing. But the sources are also there to provide feedback and help you actually develop your argument further. And this is what I would say is really referred to as what you will often hear as the academic conversation, the sort of conversation that's occurring between your ideas and the ideas of others, which is really an elevated way of thinking about how we're engaging with these outside sources that we bring into our texts. So we're going to be using this acronym BEAM, B-E-A-M, and it's going to be the foundation of our ideas for today. Okay, so BEAM stands for Background, Exhibit, Argument, and Method. And it provides for us an alternative research vocabulary that actually emphasizes use rather than source type. So rather than focusing our attention on what type of source material something is, which is how we're typically used to thinking about it, primary versus secondary, reliable versus unreliable. Instead, we're really thinking about what we might do with our sources in the context of our essay, right? So if you're thinking about, say, an ingredient, like onions, for example, there's a lot of different ways to use an onion. You can pickle an onion, it can be raw, you can cook an onion, it can be caramelized, and the flavor profile changes significantly. It's really going to bring a lot of different levels to the potential soup or dish that we're making, right? I love a cooking analogy, so just bear with me. So this is what I want you to think about as we're getting into this, this acronym and how we're applying it to source work. So once again, here's how we're breaking them down. What can a writer potentially do with this source is how we're really shifting from just simply labeling a source. For example, we've got background, which can be there to present information or establish facts. We've got exhibit, which is to explicate, interpret, or analyze. We've got argument, where we affirm, dispute, refine, or extend. And finally, we've got method, which is providing a critical lens, key terms, theory, style, perspective, or discourse. So I want to have us get into each one by one, where I'm kind of defining what the source use type is, and then we'll look at an example together and talk about some of its limitations as well as its benefits when used. So background sources are any source material that the writer presents as fact. Writers usually do not interpret or unpack background sources. Instead, you're simply pulling information from these sources, usually to provide context for a topic or to a specific claim. So for example, in a sociology paper, you might quote sources about rent and mortgage rates to support your claim that downtown LA is gentrifying. In a gender studies paper, you might quote Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court decision legalizing gay marriage, to support your claim that LGBTQ+ rights have evolved rapidly in the 21st century. Now, your claim might be arguable, but the fact that Obergefell versus Hodges legalized gay marriage is not. So this is a very, very common way that most of us are using sources to really validate the claims that we're making, to prove the points that we are making as fact. So let's look at an example here. Here we've got just an excerpt from a paper. Sweatshops are especially attractive to businesses because they allow them to make big profits by keeping manufacturing costs low. For example, even at Bangladesh's most expensive and thereby safest factories, Walmart pays a maximum of 90 cents to produce a pair of jeans. Those same jeans sell for $22 in store. giving Walmart a nearly 2,500% profit. Meanwhile, factories begin to deteriorate, leading to building collapses like Bangladesh's Rana Plaza. So here in this example, we can see that a source is being used to bring forth hard facts and statistics to make a point, right? So we've got this reference to a statistic, a piece of factual information that validates this larger point that sweatshops are using this business model. So we understand that we can't just make generalized claims without supporting them with facts. This is what that looks like. Now, keep in mind that a source that might be terrible for background information due to faulty information or bias, say, for example, an InfoWars story, but it actually might be perfect to use as an exhibit source that you can analyze and critique. My point is that we've often focused so much on what constitutes good sources that we're not necessarily engaging discourse in the type of way that we can by bringing our own original analysis to it and thinking about things that are extremely relevant to be talked about and researched, but just not used as background information or fact. What is a potential pitfall that we have if we have a paper that relies mostly on background sources only? I'll just open it up to the group. For a paper that relies mostly on background sources, what do you think is a potential pitfall? Any ideas?
I can see how it would make an argument that it's not really valid. Like it's more of an opinion piece at that point than really being able to kind of share. Just correct me if I'm wrong, when I'm thinking of background information, I think of sources like Wikipedia or sources that aren't necessarily as well vetted. And so it could lead to maybe lesser credibility towards the argument that's being proposed.
You know, that's a really good point to think about. And I often do use that analogy of avoiding a Wikipedia article to my students, right? To say your paper should not be Wikipedia articles, meaning a sort of bunch of background information or contextual history on a topic with some loosely vetted sources. Now, in the best case scenario where we've got really good vetted sources, where everything is top tier and someone's really done their work, that's the sort of best case scenario. But even still, in that case, what we end up often having is what we call the info dump, right? Where we've got a ton of information, but no original claims. And so, yeah, the worst case scenario would be the Wikipedia article. The best case scenario is the info dump, where really no new ideas or analysis are being put forth whatsoever. And that is not, for the most part, what we're really trying to get students to do. We're trying to get students to engage critically, right? So that brings us to thinking about this next type of source use, which is exhibit sources. And that's where you're really actively interpreting or reading for your audience. You might be familiar with the term close reading, and that's what we're going to talk about just next. Before we move on, any questions about background sources, or we feel pretty clear with what that is? And as I said, these are what we are typically most comfortable with and what we are taught very early on, usually in our even middle school writing of how to use, right? So they're just kind of our first entry point into source use for the most part. Okay, so exhibit sourcing. And you can see we've got this museum exhibition here, and it's very much that. It's thinking about really showcasing. When we are using exhibit sourcing, we are actively analyzing and interpreting. Exhibit sources do not speak for themselves. Instead, the author is drawing out their significance through careful, in-depth commentary. So, for example, in a literature paper, you could close read a passage from Jane Eyre to support an argument about the language women writers use to describe entrapment. In a sociology paper, you could analyze an anecdote from a case study to demonstrate the impact of poverty on feelings of self-worth. In a political science paper, you could potentially contrast the language of Obergefell versus Hodges to Terry versus Ohio, the stop and frisk clause case. And there you could be considering different definitions and interpretations of individual autonomy. So here you're not simply pointing out that these cases existed, but instead you're really actively interpreting the language of each decision in order to assess the internal logic being used. So let's look at another example. And this is taken from a literature paper. In the closing lines of Caroline or Change, Emmy argues that her actions are the product of her mother Caroline's labor. I'm the daughter of a maid. She stands alone where the harsh winds blow, salting the earth so nothing grow, too close, but still her strong blood flow, underground through hidden veins. Through Caroline, underground has referenced the basement where Caroline toils. Emmy resignifies the phrase, reinforcing its associations with foment and rebellion. Caroline believes that she has turned into a pillar of salt, but Emmy argues that her mother's strong blood flows in the next and radicalized generation. Ultimately, Kushner's play asserts that if a better world can be reached, it will be neither through appeals to an abstract deity, nor through vaguely assumed solidarity between the privileged and the oppressed. Rather, the play's titular change comes about through underground struggle among Black women. So here, when we're thinking about the exhibition's source use, we want to keep in mind that this use and term is not synonymous with the more conventional term evidence, which designates any data offered in support of a claim. Instead, exhibits can lend support to claims, but writers must interpret an exhibit source to show how it supports the claim. So you are really there to make those connections. Now, asking you all once again, what do you think is a potential risk of a paper that relies mostly on exhibit sources? What's the downside to relying on exhibit sources primarily?
I'll take a guess here. Part of it might be that it's up to interpretation. You could be consistently interpreting information incorrectly or making some pretty big leaps that weren't actually intended to be there in the first place. So, so not having the support behind it could pose problems.
Yeah, so certainly lacking real support would be problematic, but I think maybe if I'm hearing you correctly, you're also talking about a bit of lack of focus and a true intention that's valuable to the academic conversation in some ways. So if we just have a lot of exhibition and nothing else, it might fail to engage larger issues or questions, which is extremely important, right? We have to make sure that there is engagement with what other people in the field of interest are also talking about as it relates to this topic. It's important that we not stay siloed. It's important that we understand the relevancy of conversations. And also, if we happen to be saying the same thing that already has been said, which I know is hard for many of us to believe, but is actually the case oftentimes, that you are putting forth ideas that you think are your original ideas, but are in fact not your original ideas. And that's just the way that information and ideas work, right? That's not a terrible thing to discover that you've had similar ideas to others, but it does become important as an academic researcher to make sure that you're engaging with those ideas, giving credit to the research histories that have been done and the conversations that have already been had, and making them very socially relevant and societally relevant to actually move the conversation forward or the knowledge base forward in a meaningful way. So this is when we might want to consider bringing in argument use as another type of source engagement. And that's when we're actually engaging with other texts for the purpose of affirming or disputing them as they relate to our own ideas. Does that make sense with me so far? Okay. So moving on to argument sources. Argument sources are defined as any source material whose claims a writer engages directly. You enter into conversation with argument sources by challenging, refining, or extending the source's claims in some way. So this is where we start thinking about, like I said, the academic conversation. What's going on in the world around us as it relates to this topic? So some examples here. In a paper on the psychological effects of social media, you might challenge a study that shows pronounced level of depression amongst Twitter users. You could argue that correlation is not causation and that depressed people may be frequent users of Twitter, but perhaps that is because their mental health makes other forms of social interaction difficult. Another example, in a paper on the future of medicine, you might choose a Wall Street Journal article about online education to argue the most doctor visits could be digitized. In this case, you're agreeing with the basic argument that online education has a bright future, but you're still engaging with the writer's claims by extending and refining his or her argument, suggesting it could be applied in an entirely different context. This is a yes and maneuver. Back to the Obergefell example. Perhaps in a course on activism and advocacy, you want to criticize the Supreme Court's decision on same-sex marriage by arguing that its legal reasoning is unsound. In this case, you're arguing with the source rather than simply presenting it as fact or closely analyzing its language. Note that you can argue with the source even if you agree with its basic claims. In this case, that same-sex marriage should be legal. So here's another example taken from a student paper. In Achieving Our Country, Richard Rorty writes that one of the essential transformations that the cultural left will have to undergo is the shedding of its semi-conscious anti-Americanism, which it carried over from the rage of the late 60s. The left will have to stop thinking up abusive names for the system and start trying to construct inspiring images of the country. Implicit in Rorty's statement and many political discussions is that the right and the Republican Party are the true embodiment of patriotism and have been since the Vietnam War. The Democratic Party has subsequently had to struggle against the label unpatriotic, a stain on the party pride and a hindrance in national elections. Ultimately, while Rorty was correct in identifying patriotism as a key factor of political success, he fatally assumes that there is one way of defining patriotism that all Americans, or at least most, could agree upon. While the Democratic Party has embraced patriotism, it is a liberally defined patriotism. When liberals talk about improving America, they talk about a greatness that has yet to be achieved. So the bolded portion here really speaks to that yes and argumentation that I was just mentioning. So when it comes to argument sources, you need to keep in mind striving for some correlation between the academic field of your paper and the academic field of your argument sources. For example, if you're writing a history paper, focusing on scholarship from historians is important over linguists or neurologists. Now, it doesn't mean to say you can't operate interdisciplinarily, but there absolutely needs to be a consciousness about what conversations are happening interdisciplinarily and how those may change if they are. Otherwise, you want to be really conscious to work within fields and disciplines when you're bringing sources in. So what do we think a risk of writing a paper that relies mostly on argument sources might have? If we have a paper that's primarily using sources argumentatively, what is a potential pitfall? Any thoughts? I believe this came up right at the very beginning from one of our comments. Your voice could get really lost when you are focusing so heavily on what others have said that you are not actually contributing your own original ideas. Now, there are certain styles of writing that may be appropriate for this, but many are not. And you may find that your voice isn't actually able to come through. And it's difficult for you to say anything that's unique and not just entirely paraphrased or unoriginal ideas that are taken from others. So the final part of the acronym I want to move on to is the method use of sources. And this is a way, in addition to exhibit style, that you can think about bringing more originality into your work. So method sources are any source material that's used to borrow a governing concept or derive a manner of working or reading. A method source can offer a set of key terms, lay out a particular procedure, or furnish a general model or perspective that informs the framework of your paper. So for example, you might use a sociologist's definition of gentrification to help you explain changes you see in your own neighborhood. You might use a historian's definition of feminism to help you analyze the novel The Handmaid's Tale. You might extract the definition of individual autonomy from the Obergefell decision and use it to further an argument about gun control. Here, you're not really engaging with the entirety of Obergefell or even the subject it addresses, but instead you're borrowing its way of thinking to guide a discussion on a different issue. So here we've got a final example that showcases a method use of sources. Philosopher Karl Popper first popularized the notion that in order for a theory to be considered scientific, it must be falsifiable or capable of being proven incorrect by empirical means. Economic theories, however, are rarely discarded in light of contradictory evidence. For example, in the 1970s, the American economy languished in a period of stagflation, in which weak economic growth was coupled with high inflation. But according to the then popular theory of Keynesianism, stagflation was impossible. Instead of falsifying the theory and looking for alternatives, a new generation of neo-Keynesians performed what can only be described as an intellectual cop-out, claiming that certain principles of Keynesianism only hold in the short run. Unlike in the natural sciences, economists study man-made constructions like market and currencies. Therefore, a strong supporter of an economic theory can almost always find its way to spin evidence to fit personal convictions, which is more snake oil than science. So here we see a foundational theory being taken from one context into another context, which is an example of how you might be using sources from a method perspective. Okay, so now we have our sort of critical moment with method sources. It's important to keep in mind that not all terms and methods are transferable. Do not try to shoehorn ideas from one field of study into any and all arguments. There's not a one-size-fits-all model. However, you don't want to be afraid to take risks and think outside of the box when you develop your conceptual framework. So, as I mentioned, you don't want to be afraid of interdisciplinarity or looking across decades. You just have to really, really be mindful of context and the types of conversations that you're creating. So what are some potential risks of writing a paper that relies mostly on method sources? And we've already kind of highlighted one potential issue, but anything else that comes to mind? Your paper may become overly abstract or lack clarity. Again, when we sort of get away from a more concrete problem or question, it might make things a little too abstract. By including background and exhibit approaches, you can have more grounding, right? So to sum up the BEAM acronym as it's applied to source work, we've got background sources when you need facts to support a claim or provide context. Exhibit sources when you need a rich and meaty example to unpack or interpret. Argument sources when you need to explain how others, scholars, or professionals have approached your topic. And method sources when you need a working definition of a term or when you need to anchor your paper in a field of study or discourse. And not surprisingly, at this point, you should be getting the idea that most academic writing engages all four to some degree. So we are really using these very fluidly and consciously, and it's a real important step when we are bringing in outside sources beyond just is this a verifiable source or am I citing it correctly, which of course those things matter, right? But we're really talking about putting our voices into discourse communities in an ethical way, in a responsible way, in a meaningful way, in a contributional way. So once again, just to kind of sum things up and get us to be thinking about how we actually shift this into our own ways of practice, because I think the concepts are quite easy to understand. When we break them down in those categories, they're quite easy to understand. But applying them to our actual research and writing can be a more complicated process. So what I encourage you to do is really think about this acronym and how it can transfer itself into a set of critical questions that you can apply to your research and writing. So when it comes to considering background, asking yourself the question, how am I going to give, what information do I need to give to readers to help them understand the context of my paper and accept the paper's claims as factual? When do I need to bring in information to compel my readers to understand something better or make them feel that my points are valid? For exhibit sources, what materials can I analyze for my reader that would really help illustrate claims, right? I often talk about just considering showing, not just telling. The background source use is a lot of telling, where you're relaying facts and information. The exhibiting is really where you're showing. As humans and understanding concepts, especially difficult academic concepts, examples are key. And they're also the way that you really connect to your work in a meaningful way. Argument sources. This is where you're really thinking about establishing the conversation. What have some other writers said about your topic? And what do you have to say in reply? It's really important that you have an awareness of what others are saying and have said. Of course, to engage in integrity, to make sure that you are crediting ideas properly, but also to be a real meaningful member of the conversation to help mobilize the conversation. And then finally, what key terms or fields of study might help you best frame your discussion? So I want us to think about the fact that there is not a linear process with this. It's a much more iterative process, and it may not even be something that you want to engage with until you actually have somewhat of an approximate thesis, somewhat of a rough plan to your paper, somewhat of an outline. To answer all these questions at the very start of your writing process would be entirely overwhelming. But to revisit these as you're going through, as you start the research process, as you've already got some sources, right? Many of us go through sort of a research and collection phase where we're like, okay, let me just compile everything that I can think of or I've read about this topic. And then you can maybe go to the next stage of how am I actually going to use these? How do I imagine myself engaging with these sources in a meaningful way? And that will help lead us to thinking about how we can start to fill research gaps, which is what the intention of academic research is really about. As I said, furthering knowledge, not just regurgitating information that's already out there. So I did have an activity that I was going to have us do, but I think maybe I'll just kind of walk through this together in the interest of time. So I wanted to just kind of show you what this process could potentially look like. So this is an example paper that is thinking about an argument that relates to the appeal of zombies and mainstream culture. It makes the argument that zombie narratives have become incredibly popular because they reflect the breakdown of public discourse. Victims cannot reason or even communicate with zombies, just like many Americans who feel hopelessly estranged from their fellow citizens. So this here lists out some points that the author intends to make. And then on the other side, we have the questions that I encouraged you to ask about what potential source uses you might have to help you with the illustration, analysis, and validation of the points that you want to make. So I'll just go ahead and jump over to the next slide here, which just kind of shows some potential ideas of how you could brainstorm using sources here. And there's no right or wrong to this, by the way. It's really, you know, a very creative and generative process that you might go through. I know that I've personally had the experience of thinking something was a really quote good source and then getting into it and realizing, well, you know, I don't know about this. I don't know about how quality of a study this actually is, or if I can make this claim without, you know, more longitudinal evidence. I start bringing my critical eye to it and thinking about using it in a different way. Or, you know, starting to run into something that really sparked my interests and I'm starting to make connections. There's lots of things that happen that I want you to leave yourself open to, and that sometimes just sort of checking off the boxes for the assignment prompt can sometimes limit us too. So I know there's a lot to get into here, but I just wanted to sort of highlight the different things that you could do for each of the points that you wanted to make. And I also just wanted to kind of give you the span out to see that truly most academic work is going to be using sources of different types in a lot of different ways. And that all of these options are really available to you in your academic research. Any questions here or comments on anything so far? Okay. I also wanted us to think about how, not only how to use this in our writing, which I think is very, very valuable, but this acronym and this philosophy can be used in other contexts as well. For example, we can use it as a critical reading practice. I think it goes without saying to me that the relationship between critical reading and critical writing are very linked, but bringing that critical eye to the research that we're doing, and also really holding up what we are interpreting to the standards that we are often evaluated as well with our own work that we put out there. I also sort of start to showcase how this can be a potential invention activity. Before you actually start researching, you can write down what source uses you think might be helpful, right? Going back to that cooking analogy, how do you think new dishes get created? There's a lot of experimenting that goes on, right? And you'll taste something and be like, I think I need to modify that. Or, oh, that was not quite right. There was too much of that. So I want you to think about the source use and writing process in a similar way, that there's a lot of back and forth, and it's not just, oh, I found my peer-reviewed source, plug it in, put my 2 quotations that I'm required to use. We want to think really less superficially than that, and also realize that there's, like I said, an iterative process that takes place. Finally, Beam can be used really effectively as a revision tool. So I don't know how many of you have heard of the technique of reverse outline, but it's something that's really useful, especially if you're finding issues with organization, but also issues with evidence or support in some way. It's where you can really look at your piece, or even if you've received feedback from your instructor, and kind of take a step back and ask yourself, what's really going on here? And then you can really look at each of your sources and how you're using them, and ask yourself, could they be used differently or in a better way? Am I only using this in a superficial or limited way that I'm not really getting the most out of the source, or not, even perhaps doing the sourcing of justice to how it actually is contributing to a larger conversation? So I finally just want to wrap us up before we get into questions, talking a bit about some resources I would recommend. There's a very good book called They Say, I Say, which is written by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein. Some people can find this process a little bit overwhelming, engaging with sources in a much deeper way, and just kind of thinking, how do I even structure my engagement from a writerly perspective? This book actually has a lot of templates that you can use that I think are very helpful for academic writers who are trying to learn how to have discourse, not just sort of plugging in sources, but rather really engaging with them. We have a lot of copies available at the Writing Center you can come and use. They're also very inexpensive to get the paperbacks or used copies, but it's a great book that I would recommend. The Writing Center, we're an actual physical resource that exists on campus that can help you at any stage of this process. I always say to students, you don't have to have writing to come into the Writing Center. You don't even have to have an assignment. You could come to us right when you get an assignment, and we can start brainstorming and mapping ideas with you. You could come to just say, hey, I want to work on this particular skill, and we can do that together. Or it could very much be, I got this feedback from my instructor and I want to understand it better. Anything, any stage of the process, we're here to help you with. So we are located in Taper Hall. We largely are an appointment only service. Not to say you couldn't get a walk-in. It's possible, but I certainly wouldn't bet on it, especially at the busier times of the semester. But we have a lot of availability in our schedule, both for face-to-face in-person sessions, also plenty of remote sessions. So if you prefer to have remote sessions, they're both available. Another really great feature of the Writing Center, which I personally love and refer students to all the time, is we have a section of our website that says handouts and video tutorials. And these are all originally crafted materials from different consultants and writing program and writing center faculty and directors over the years, where we've just put a lot of our materials together to help students in a variety of areas. But as it relates to this topic, looking at differentiation between scholarly and popular sources. We've got a lot of things on citation and source and quote integration. So if you're struggling with citation, that's something we can really help you with too. Evidence versus analysis. We touched on this a bit, but really thinking about how you can elevate the evidence that you're bringing in to be more analytical. Getting into more scientific writing, thinking about things like tables, charts, graphs. These are just a few of the topics that I thought might be relevant, but please see us as a resource to you in all kinds of ways. If you want to engage more passively and don't know if you're quite ready to meet with somebody yet, there's lots of materials there on the website for you. But I encourage you to meet with a writing center tutor. So who works there are all graduate students and faculty across disciplines. If you go on the site, you can see the bios of everyone who works there. So you could potentially work with someone who specializes in a particular area or even your field of study. But we represent a diverse range of interests and expertise. And yeah, we're there to help you figure this out or really anything else you're interested in learning about. And here is my works cited. And with that, I will open it up to all of you. Questions, comments? I'm just gonna pop us over to the Writing Center website. Please feel free to use the chat for questions or raise your hand if something comes up. But let me just go over to the Writing Center website just so I can show you where that is and what that looks like. Okay, can you all see my screen? The easiest way to get there is just USC Writing Center. There we go. So if you would like to make an appointment, you just go to appointments. If you've never been on our site before, you'll just need to create a user login. It's very quick. And click here to book an appointment. It will tell you all about our scheduling and all that kind of stuff. You can have up to 50 minutes per week. So that could either be one session of 50 minutes or two 25-minute sessions at separate times. You can work with different tutors, the same tutors. It's totally up to you. This was what I was mentioning, this handout section. So many useful things here. You can just see a bunch of different categories that are kind of broken down by skills. There's videos, there are samples, all kinds of things. But regarding what we were just talking about, we have a section on citations that has all kinds of stuff about just high level understanding what plagiarism is. We have things specialized in MLA, in APA, in Chicago style. Those are the three main areas that we focus on at the Writing Center, although there are other tutors that work in different citation styles as well. So definitely check out the bios if you want to work with someone in a particular discipline. And yeah, we also have this section, reading critically and integrating sources, which I think, is the sort of second component that sometimes gets a little bit forgot about. The citations and sourcing from the technical standpoint is very important, but we really want to think about critical reading, critical thinking, and integrating sources. So these are some of those handouts that I mentioned as well. But there's a lot of useful stuff on here in all kinds of different areas. There's also an entire section for graduate students and I think that once you get to the graduate level, there are some different expectations as it pertains to some of these things. And there's some specific handouts there too. All right. Any questions for me before we wrap up?
I have a question, but I don't know if it's more curiosity. Have you seen students come in and ask about how to incorporate ChatGPT into their writing, if it's allowed by instructors. I know some instructors will be creative with the ChatGPT tool and invite that tool to, for example, argue or, take the opposing position of this ChatGPT output. I don't know what you've seen and what's your guidance on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can kind of talk about that from two different angles. As a professor myself, it was at the beginning of this academic year, so last semester, that we as professors were notified that we had to include a policy about ChatGPT usage in our syllabus, but that we had essentially 4 different levels of usage that we could invite into our classroom, which ranged from absolutely not allowed in my classroom in any circumstances on one end to it's absolutely invited in these particular ways, and then some things in the middle. So we were really given a lot of autonomy as instructors to make our pedagogical decisions about how the usage made sense for our classes. That has not necessarily made Writing Center work easy because there is such a range of how different classes are using it, are not using it. And unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of ability to vet for what's allowed and not allowed, because we're not typically asking to look at the syllabi of the students that come into the Writing Center. I will say that I personally have not had a lot of students that I've worked with, but some. Like I remember working with a law student not long ago, that was really making an argument about how ChatGPT had a really important function in providing legal advice to communities that could not afford to work with attorneys. Like that's just one example that pops in my mind. So I think they're incredibly meaningful conversations to be had around it. I will also say that sometimes I suspect that there is ChatGPT used and I don't always know how to navigate the conversations because, as I said, there's a lot of different stances right now on how it's being used. But I guess I would say it depends and we're still figuring it out. Other questions?
Thank you so much for participating in our AI week this semester. I'm
Thank you
like,
so much for having
yeah, for me, I'm just like, I never heard of like this method in this way. It's been a while since I've like written like for a professor or anything like that, since I've been working professionally for some years. But I'm like, I want to spend more time with your slides to like take it all in. And also I think about the conversations that we as coordinators or those that are hearing cases with students, and we talk about plagiarizing and like in-text citations and how students are going about doing their research or writing, like both doing research and then writing like their analysis or the information in their own words. So hearing this method and the words that were used here, I definitely want to spend more time with your slides because I think it will be helpful for us coordinators or anyone that's really hearing cases to ask students if they've learned about or if they've heard of other like the BEAM method or what have you. So thank you so much. This is really insightful. Again, a lot of it for me is like I've seen it, heard about it, but maybe not in this way because it's been some time since I got my master's. So the writing is a little bit different, but I'm like, this is useful and I can see how we can use this information in conversations with students regarding their writing process.
Yeah, and I think, the culture is just continuing to change all the time
Yeah.
because of the information age that we're in. And that's why it's such an important distinction that we start talking about like, well, it's not so much just the good and bad source conversation. It's not so much like, did you provide a citation or not? Like, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think, it's a difficult process for students to navigate. So yeah,
like even when you were asking like if there's these are my words, but like if there's too much of this, what can that do to a paper or the information? I'm like, that those are great questions. Like we're not always asking questions like that, but like I think about how we have conversations with students and how helpful, like thinking about how students incorporate what have you in their paper, or how they're doing research. Too much of something, could also take away from X, Y, and Z. So this is really good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. And yes, we really hope that you'll direct students our way. And if you have any questions, or if we can provide more of anything to y'all, we'd be happy to do that.
Fantastic. Dr. Hopmeyer, really just thank you so much. I think we can go ahead and stop the recording at this point.
Yes. Okay.